Over the last 5 episodes, or for those of you who are counting the last 3 hours of our story, we've followed a group of California executives and designers as they've attempted to create the largest themed resort in the world. We've looked at disputes that broke out on the construction site, including one where the prime contractor was fired, and we've also looked at ongoing tensions inside of the Disney company as the people who run the park want a larger role in design, and also as Roy Disney, now in his late 70s, prepares again to retire. We've seen Disney lower their attendance expectations for the opening of the resort as some attractions and both hotels remained unfinished, while expectations in the press, largely as a result of Disney's early PR efforts, kept rising. Today, on our episode, we will focus entirely on Walt Disney World's opening day, October 1st, 1971. At night, while most of Central Florida was asleep, transit crews removed the tape and plastic coverings from the recently installed traffic signs so that the words Disney World were now visible to drivers rolling down local highways. Though hopeful guests had been asked to stop camping alongside Highway 192, in the pre-dawn hours cars returned to the resort's entrance road. None were allowed to line up, so many simply circled the entrance, rolling up and down 192, hoping to be the first to drive into the resort. For the most part, Disney cast members didn't know what exactly to expect. Long before dawn, they started to arrive to their assigned locations. Debbie Dane, who lived with her parents, recalled, quote, "All 3 of us woke about 3 in the morning. Nobody could get back to sleep, so everyone piled into the car and we headed to the Polynesian Hotel, where I was scheduled to report at 5. Likewise, outside Disney property, another wave of state troopers arrived to manage traffic. Aubrey O'Pry, district commander for the Highway Patrol, said, quote, "If 9,000 to 10,000 cars show up Friday morning, we're going to have a problem." 10,000 cars would likely mean around 30,000 guests, which was at the lower end of the Highway Patrol's projected range of attendance. In terms of supervision, the opening was largely managed by Dick Nunes, Don Tatum, and Card Walker. Quote, "Among the no-shows was Roy Disney," one reporter noted, "brother of Walt, who dreamed all this up." Roy remained in California attending to his wife while one of her relatives was in the hospital. As though planned, his absence deepened the impression that he was beginning to pass the reins of the Florida resort to others. But Nunes understood that Roy's absence presented an additional problem. Roy wouldn't be able to observe how guests moved down Main Street or wondered at the castle. Instead, he would judge the success or failure of opening day almost entirely through numbers. Quote, "I think," Nunes said, "he really believed that we would have a 100,000 day." In this, executives felt Roy's expectations weigh them down, his need for the Florida resort to be a quick success to justify the tremendous gamble he had made on this project, also to create a sure path for him to retire, leaving the Florida project a proven success in the hands of others. Inside the Magic Kingdom, many areas were still unfinished, but crews spent the final hours preparing it as best they could for guests, putting up a few more seedlings and washing down sidewalks. One observer noted that long before sunrise, quote, "painters were still working on the ice cream parlor along Main Street." Around this same time, Dick Nunes asked Jim Cora to drive out to the highway and report on traffic so managers could best manage the crowd as it arrived. Quote, "Dick told me to take his car," Cora explained, "because it had a 2-way radio in it, and go out as far as I could and see how far back the line was." But Cora soon discovered the highway leading to the resort, except for that small knot of cars right at the entrance road, was mostly empty. Quote, "I called in and said, 'There's nobody out here, Dick.'" "What?" Nunes replied. Cora repeated, "There's nobody here." "Maybe it's too early," Nunes quipped. "Just stay out there until the crowd starts to build." Believing that a crowd of some sort was headed to the resort, Nunes took to the air, hoping to manage a crisis before it happened. For months, the north-south road off US 192 had been used for construction, but as of this morning, it was designated only for public use. Hovering in a helicopter sometime around 6 a.m., Nunes, Card Walker, Don Tatum, and Ron Miller watched the ground below, hoping to handle traffic congestion before it became a serious issue. Finally, they noticed activity in the distance. Quote, "They saw the headlights coming from Orlando toward the park," one Disney engineer recalled. "Okay," they said, "here they come." They watched as a long line of high beams cut through the darkness in their direction. But the cars didn't angle toward the entrance road. Quote, "When they got to Highway 535, which was the road running along the back entrance, everybody turned off." Nunes was the first to understand. Somewhat depressed, he turned to Ron Miller and said, "Those are employees coming to work." During these same hours, another story was playing out at the Polynesian. Around 5 a.m., Charlie Ridgway arrived at the hotel, hoping that it was at least in modestly better shape than it had been the previous night. He was surprised how much work had been finished. Quote, "There were these beautiful chandeliers hanging down," he explained, "and wallpaper was up, and carpet on the floor, and all these tables and chairs had phones ringing off the hook. It was unbelievable. Newsmen were there drinking coffee and eating pastries and waiting for me to brief them. They had no clue what a disaster this area was just hours before." Likewise, others in the Disney party were surprised how much better the Polynesian appeared at dawn. Patty Disney, daughter-in-law of Roy, recalled that as she went to sleep, quote, "There had been sand outside of the hotel. We opened the curtains the next morning and there was sod, green grass everywhere. We called it the miracle of the sod." But the sudden beauty of the hotel was most appreciated by those who had seen it the previous day, a type of beauty that could be teased out primarily through comparison. To reporters, the complex looked like an unfinished resort. There were, quote, "wet paint signs on the stairs and, quote, bags of peat moss stacked outside the main entrance." Overall, though, reporters were content to finally be on Disney property, to experience firsthand the new resort. They were also a little confused that a project of this size had so little security. The previous night, officials had simply asked them which papers or magazines they represented, then handed out identification stickers without checking names against any list. Quote, "Very informal," one noted. "No fancy badges or press kits or identification requirements. Can't help thinking anyone could walk off the street and say, 'I'm with the Ciderville Press,' and get a sticker." Once the press group was assembled, Ridgway took them over to the Magic Kingdom on the monorail. One participant explained, quote, "We glide along in darkness. Lights twinkle in the Magic Kingdom." She also noticed that construction continued, including that, quote, "Workmen are attaching a roof to a boat dock." Inside the Magic Kingdom, cast members moved through the tunnels to supply restaurants with food and shops with merchandise. There was a long line leading into the cavernous depths of the wardrobe department as hundreds dressed for work in everything from Western outfits to monorail uniforms. In this world without windows, an air of nervousness moved from person to person as they stepped upstairs to enter the Magic Kingdom. As Disney had not yet color-coded the tunnels and clearly identified which set of stairs led to which land, a group of cast members, many of whom were hired initially to work the campgrounds when it opened in a month, sat in folding chairs at junction spots between two tunnels. Their only job on that first day was, quote, "to help lost employees find their way through the utilidors to the right department or service location up in the park." Above the tunnels, in various areas of the park, plumbers were still installing drinking fountains and construction crews were taking down the last of the scaffolding. Trucks outfitted with fogging equipment rolled through Adventureland, the Polynesian, and other densely planted areas to make sure that guests, and more importantly the press, weren't bothered by insects. At 7 o'clock, Ridgway took some members of the press with him again on the monorail from the Magic Kingdom to the Ticket and Transportation Center, as the resort was about to pick the first family. Following the tradition of Disneyland, executives would hand out a lifetime pass to a family that was the first to enter the resort. Only as there were many ticket booths leading to the entrance, the first family wouldn't necessarily be the first to arrive. Rather, one family selected from those lined up for early entry. As Ridgway glided on the monorail into the station, he saw for the first time the mostly empty parking lot. Quote, "There were several hundred cars," he noticed, "and 1,000 or so guests waiting at the front gate, but not a big mob." He then knew with certainty that, quote, "the press predictions were way off," and that one of the primary challenges for the day would be to convince the press that a half-empty park was still a success. He then stepped off the monorail and with a showman's flourish guided the press down to the gates where a line of people each hoped to be the first official guest. The story of the first visitors began about 40 minutes earlier as security crews opened the entrance and allowed cars to drive down the road that led to the parking area. Drivers were quick to pay the 50-cent parking fee and then to park. Once out of their cars, groups ran toward the ticketing booth hoping to be first. Among the groups was the Windsor family. Bill Windsor and his wife Marty, along with their children Jay and Lee, who were respectively 3 and 1 years old. Like others interested in arriving early, the Windsors had slept the previous night in their car, a Volkswagen which they parked behind a Texaco gas station just outside Disney property. After waking, they decided to skip breakfast. They drove directly to Disney property, and when security guards opened the entrance road, they drove in. They were first to one of the ticketing windows where they bought tickets and with a few hundred other hopefuls waited to enter the park. As Disney managers remained concerned that the major pinch point for operations was the monorail and the boats, supervisors discussed the possibility of opening the gates even earlier than they discussed the previous day. But this plan was scuttled by the media. Though newspaper photographers could capture good images of the first visitors with a flash, TV cameras needed sunlight to create footage that would play well on screen. With this, a decision was made to delay the selection until around 7:30, when the sun was high enough for video. At that point, the first visitors, or what inside of Disney was called the first family, would be selected and ushered into the resort. The selection process, as explained to the press, was that the first family would be chosen at random and then greeted by Disney World Goodwill Ambassador Debbie Dane. Specifically, one reporter said that the version of the story he received was that, quote, Goodwill Ambassador Debbie Dane pushed a button and computers selected the turnstile, which admitted the first official family to set foot inside the attraction. But the actual selection process was far more controlled, with the goal of finding a group that would represent a photographic image of a young family on vacation, which was how the resort wanted to market itself. This task was left to Disney advertising manager Jack Lindquist. By the time guests were lined up at the ticketing booths, Lindquist observed that he had a problem. As it was a school day, most of the people who were technically eligible to be the first guests were adults. Quote, I selected the people who would be the first ones to walk into Walt Disney World, he said. I did that by walking the gate and looking at people at the front of the line. I wanted a family who represented a typical Disney family to me. But he soon found that there were only 2 families complete with young kids at the front of the line. Quote, I picked a family with a father who looked like Jack Nicklaus and a mother who looked like Mrs. Brady from the TV show The Brady Bunch. At 7:36, the gates opened to allow the Windsors to enter. Another young man still waiting yelled out, Hey, I was first in line. But no one listened to him as everyone's eyes were on the one family who was passing to the other side of the gates. The Windsors were met by the Pearly Band from Mary Poppins, who serenaded them with ragtime. But even during this ceremony, one person noted that, quote, their music was mixed with the sound of construction noise coming from the 2 nearby hotels. The press gathered around the family of 4. When I was little, Bill Windsor said, I always dreamed of going to Disneyland. Today is for these fellows, he said, pointing to his kids. It was worth sleeping all night in the car. After a round of photos, the Windsors, along with a group of reporters, boarded the monorail where they were carried to the Magic Kingdom. Understanding that other guests would soon follow, one cast member, seeing them, called out, "Here come the real people!" because construction and cleaning crews were still on Main Street. Even as the Windsors were walking up to the train station, crews were moving their equipment backstage. Quote, "Construction was just slow in my estimation," Jim Cora explained. "We had bulldozers going out the back door of Fantasyland as the public was being let in the front gate." Scott Gerard, who worked on the landscaping team, recalled that after a night of frantic planting, the same was true for his division. Quote, "I was in the Magic Kingdom when the sun came up that morning, and we were washing down around the planting areas and literally ran out the backstage gates as guests were coming down Main Street." None of this, however, was visible to the Windsors. Instead, the Windsors walked through the entrance tunnel to find a near-empty park. They were greeted by Mickey Mouse. After exploring Town Square, they rode in the green omnibus up Main Street, accompanied by Goofy and Pluto, as camera operators stationed on the roofs of Main Street shops captured all of it on film. They were given a lifetime pass and one of the few remaining rooms at the Polynesian where they would also have lunch. When asked about the experience, Bill Windsor looked at his two sons, then said, "They're enjoying it, but I must admit I'm enjoying it more." About 20 minutes after the Windsors walked onto Main Street, other guests began to arrive at the Magic Kingdom, largely by monorail. Some guests were surprised they had to share the monorail with construction workers moving between the Polynesian and the Contemporary. WED manager Orlando Ferrante recalled that he had to come up out of the basement to see the first guests as they came into the park. Quote, "We were over there, standing on the balcony of the castle, watching the people start to come in." The crowd, though, was far smaller than anyone had expected. All morning, Disney managers waited for a surge of traffic to pull up the entrance road, but that surge never materialized. Reporters repeatedly asked midday for attendance figures, but requests were turned down as officials were unwilling to, quote, "guess." Instead, Disney managers, when speaking to the press, focused on the positives. Quote, "It is good to hear those turnstiles clicking for real at last," one said. By midday, managers knew that early attendance figures were a disaster. Quote, Florida Highway Patrol Sergeant Jim Humphreys said park officials gave him an unofficial turnstile count at noon of 2,800, meaning that by midday there were far more employees in the kingdom than guests. In the early afternoon, a security guard was quoted as saying that there were only 5,000 paying customers in the park, which was particularly troubling as the park was only open for a few more hours and would close at 6 p.m. The same was true outside the park. All morning, the State Department of Transportation was prepared with additional officers, some stationed around predictable trouble spots on 192. In all, there were 89 troopers focused on the resort's opening. A separate crew of road workers was ready to lay down up to 4,000 traffic cones to reroute travelers if the main road became choked with cars. George Holder, an engineer with the State Department of Transportation, said, quote, "It looks like everyone stayed home. There are probably more people watching over the situation than there are involved in it." The one actual point of concern, ironically, turned out to be air traffic. Patrol helicopters and planes observing the highways were mixed in with local pilots and Cessnas and other small planes trying to catch glimpses of opening day from the air. Of particular concern to the amateurs were the large number of helicopters. Quote, "They can rise straight up," one pilot said. "They're hard to spot and at times unpredictable." Inside the park, most guests were having a lovely time. Some were surprised by the pervasiveness of music, a combination of recorded tracks, live musicians, and mechanical performance. Quote, "It's everywhere," one person noted. "Sometimes it comes from calliopes, other times from a marching band, but more often than not, it will come from one of the many small combos sprinkled throughout the grounds." Along with music, many were surprised by the cinematic realism arranged into animatronic attractions. Nella Owens, an attraction hostess at the Hall of Presidents, explained, quote, "A lot of people still want to know if we hired professional actors for the show." Debbie Wren, also a hostess, was surprised to find that, quote, "Some people really think they're alive." Along with the mechanical wonders, most everyone noticed the ongoing construction. One visitor explained crews were still, quote, "planting trees, nailing down rooftops, and building attractions." Main Street was the only area fully finished. Tomorrowland only offered one working attraction, which was a surprise to many visitors. A reporter from Palm Beach quipped, quote, "World of Tomorrow is not open today." According to another paper, beyond Tomorrowland, quote, "Adventureland, Frontierland, and Fantasyland were only partially ready." Some attractions would not open until later in the year. The Circle Vision Theater would hopefully be ready by November 15th, but Flight to the Moon might not be finished until mid-December. Peter Pan Flight and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea remain closed due to electrical and track problems. Likewise, the three-story paddle wheeler in Rivers of America was docked in Liberty Square, still not quite ready for the public. One reporter found a guest, Diane Newman, who 16 years earlier had also attended Disneyland's opening day. Though she liked the new park, Newman pointed out that at Disneyland's opening, quote, "the crowd was much bigger than this." There were a handful of opening day incidents. One of the horses pulling the streetcar, after being spooked by the omnibus, broke loose of his harness and ran down Main Street. No one was injured except for the driver, Sam Edwards, who pulled a muscle while trying to control the 2,000-pound animal. On the monorails, a female host was sent home as she discovered her bikini underwear clearly showed through the host uniform she tried on for the first time that morning. And out by the resort entrance, 3 boys playing hooky from school tried to sneak into the park by following the path of the monorail until they reached the Magic Kingdom. Beyond the experience of individual guests, the story of that first day was one that was rather painfully arranged into numbers. The Magic Kingdom was visited by roughly 8,000 paying guests. It wasn't even a modest crowd. The official number executives handed out was just over 10,000, 10,422 to be exact. But to get to that number, as Nunes would later explain, quote, "We had to count up all the comps coming through the back gate," as it would have been a public embarrassment to post a figure below 5 digits. Cardwalker remembered that though the park was in better shape than when Disneyland opened in 1955, quote, "we weren't finished, we weren't trained." He hoped that a sense of enthusiasm might somehow carry them through the day. Some attractions, mostly finished, such as the 3-story paddle wheeler, might appear on Saturday. Likewise, though the electrical system on Peter Pan's flight wasn't working, crews hoped to have it online later that weekend. But as questions came in about unfinished attractions, a Disney spokesperson admitted that due to unforeseen problems, the subs, quote, "might not open until after January 1st. In terms of hotels, the grounds of the Polynesian were open to curious guests, though construction continued there as well. One visitor noted, quote, "workmen were pouring concrete walks, planting ferns and palms, and laying carpet." Another said, quote, "we saw workmen inside the pool." Across Seven Seas Lagoon, the Contemporary was still so deep in construction that, aside from a handful of garden wing rooms, it was entirely closed off to the public. John Curry, the director of Disney's new hotel division, told one reporter that it, quote, "remains a week away from completion." But anyone in the Contemporary could easily see that it was far more than a week from completion. Long ago, Disney had stopped taking public reservations for the month of October and instead was only booking November onward. One cast member said, quote, "talk about glum. On management, there were some long faces." Some supervisors faced the problem with an air of practicality. They saw it as an opportunity to introduce newly hired cast members to the wonders inside of a Disney park. Quote, We were told to go in costume and ride everything so we would be able to answer questions, one hourly cast member, Tony Rhodes, recalled. Then come back and let the other half of our attraction take their turn. There weren't that many attractions open yet, so it didn't take all day. Another longtime operations manager explained, quote, "We thought 50,000 people would show up, and when they didn't, some of us thought we were in trouble." Yet another would later admit that after opening day, quote, "Most of us went out and sold our stock as fast as we could." On Friday, even at closing, the stock was still valued at $108, as news of the slow opening hadn't yet hit major papers. In terms of serious criminal or traffic issues, there were none, aside from a couple of fender benders. At one point, patrol officers were concerned that a group of young people, described as hippies camping in nearby woods, might try to sneak into the Magic Kingdom. Police monitored the campers by air, but the campers were clearly interested in activities far outside the Magic Kingdom. The central problem was how the resort was presented in the press and perceived by the public. Disney managers wanted to emphasize that the resort was a multi-day experience far larger than the theme park, which included outdoor recreation activities and water sports. But nearly all visitors on that first day arrived to see just the Magic Kingdom. This led to a type of theatrical production in which cast members pretended to be guests, so press photos would showcase a range of activities available on property. On Seven Seas Lagoon, cast members piloted boats intended for guest rental, so the water would be dotted with outriggers, ski boats, and 14-foot-long Capri sailboats. Though Kathy Martin had spent her morning at the main gate, once the initial surge was over, she was shifted over to the Polynesian, where she and other cast members took, quote, "a Capri on the water for publicity. We had to keep all the watercraft in use for pictures. The guests mostly were going to the park, so we were the ones in the boats." Another area of concern was the golf course, though that assignment wasn't given to hourly cast members. The first to tee off at the Magnolia was a group of WED engineers who, until early that morning, had worked on attractions inside the park. That WED group included longtime electrical engineer Sam Hamill and structural engineer Don Edgren, both of whom had years earlier worked to create Disneyland as well. Though the problem of attendance was largely lost on guests, it was not lost on reporters. The press was quick to seize the issue, as they had expected to see a madhouse, an event that might even be historic. According to one local paper, quote, "the crowds were small and the traffic jams non-existent." When reporters weren't in the park, they were housed at the Polynesian Resort, where Card Walker managed the press room. Walker would later explain that, quote, "the worst time in my life was at the Polynesian on opening day, a question and answer session with newsmen. They were asking, why were there only 10,000 people that day? All of us wanted to kill ourselves." At one point, it was clear that adults outnumbered children roughly 10-1. The executive team was hopeful for a larger crowd on the weekend with kids out of school. When pressed, Walker told reporters that they expected to have higher attendance on the 2 days that followed. Quote, "we'll be very happy," he said, "if we get 20,000 to 25,000 for Saturday and Sunday." In addition to the low numbers, there was also this, quote, "a poll of license plates in the parking lot showed that attendance was running more than 80% Floridians. In other words, the opening wasn't drawing actual tourists from outside of the state. The people in the park were mostly locals checking out the newest neighborhood excitement." At the end of the day, reporters settled in for the night at the Polynesian, but even the hotel reminded them how far the resort was from completion. Only one of the 3 restaurants was open, the Papit Bay Veranda. Beyond this, no other food service areas were finished at either hotel. The pool area and many walking paths weren't finished. The reporters themselves occupied 102 rooms, which represented most of the finished wings at the hotel. And even when reporters were in their rooms, they found that the TVs designed to work only with a closed-circuit signal, weren't yet connected to that system, leaving them nothing to watch at night. Once reporters were finished with dinner and had all shuffled off to their rooms, upper management held a meeting to figure out how to best proceed. The attendance numbers they knew were a problem. No matter how many times Disney executives explained that early October was a preview period, the press would see these figures as a sign of failure. The numbers, especially once the comps were subtracted out, were significantly below internal Disney projections as well. The one bit of luck Disney executives had was this. October 1st, both opening day and the beginning of the Disney fiscal year happened to fall on a Friday, which meant that the resort had 2 more days to rectify its image before financial markets opened again on Monday. The executive team, which included Jack Lindquist, Dick Nunis, Don Tatum, and Card Walker, could only hope that the weekend produced better results. The story of Disney World is often presented as a success story. The resort is absolutely a success. But there were some difficult moments the leadership team needed to move through to find that success. We are now up to the point where opening day is going to cause significant problems for executives, especially as Roy returns to Florida. Also in the mix, as Disney has suspended hotel reservations for the entire month of October, they don't have internal data to forecast tourist visitation for the next 4 weeks, and instead have to rely on information they receive from outside sources. At this point in the moment, some people on the leadership team aren't entirely sure that the resort is going to produce the type of results they'd once anticipated. But that is right where we're going to pick up next Sunday. If I have a little extra time this week, I'll also add in a short midweek episode focused on another recent addition to the Florida resort. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. If you enjoy these episodes, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. What generally happens is that listeners find our podcast usually through a friend or a post on social media, listen for a few months, and then, if they're interested, decide that it's something they'd like to support. On our end, I can tell you that we would simply cease to exist without subscribers. Over on Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.